So our next speaker is going to be Jacob McAuliffe, and he's going to be talking about a very interesting subject, a lot of terms that don't seem to have intersections, so I'm curious to see where the blend comes in. The title of his talk is Philosophy, Piety, and Popular Magic, Early Modern Demonological Discourse in Old and New England. So,
just put this on.
Yeah.
It's a lot less complicated than it sounds, but we'll go through. Hey, can you hear me? Is this good? Is it on? Hello? Is it on?
The lapel is only for the keyboard.
Oh, I see. That's cool. Okay, so thanks to Dr. LaFountain for that really, really interesting talk. And now, as they say, time for something completely different, though it does have a few intersections that maybe would be interesting to talk about. But anyways, as Professor Cornley said, my name's Jake McAuliffe. I was a senior in the fall, and I'll be graduating in May before going on to graduate studies at Yale University next year. So today I'll be presenting my senior thesis project in the history department. And this is actually some continued research that I did while I was studying abroad in England. And I kind of continued that research because it afforded the unique opportunity to do a sort of transatlantic research project, right? With primary sources from both Oxford and Boston, the two best places to get them, and the chance to be in the actual locales that I was studying. And so I just want to start a bit with talking about how I got into this project, a bit of a background on the historiography of witchcraft studies, and then we'll move on to what I actually did in my thesis. So first, let's start with the historiography of witchcraft studies, so the history of witchcraft studies. So this is up on the slide is a reading list from my tutorial while I was in England, and it shows a glimpse of some of the many subjects that are talked about when you're dealing with, the notion of a witch, right, in the early modern period, specifically in England, and as you can see from the topics on this reading list, witchcraft studies are interdisciplinary and very complex, right? In fact, the study of witchcraft in early modern Europe is sort of like a weather vane that charts the changing winds of historiography in the study of history. For instance, in the 1970s to 1980s, the historiography that accompanied the study of witches was associated with social history, which was very prevalent at the time. And then in recent years, witchcraft studies have actually conformed to the rise of a new postmodern historical paradigm, which endeavored to explain how a belief in witches was actually rational within the intellectual framework of that period. And that kind of connects with a lot of what Dr. LaFountain was saying about, the death of the disenchantment thesis. This idea that scientific progress would automatically preclude the idea of witches as being challenged in these days. And I count myself as part of that study as well. So this same chart can kind of be applied to thoughts on the history of witchcraft, specifically in early modern England and New England, which I talked about. In the 1980s, the historical and anthropological works of a period when witchcraft was actually still a dominant belief. So this led me specifically to look at the writings of demonologists, those who studied witches, demons, and the like. Specifically Joseph Glanville, a chaplain in England, and Cotton Mather, the eminent Boston minister. And so I looked at these in a more critical manner, attempting to form a model for how people actually thought about witchcraft in the 17th and early 18th centuries. So I looked at these two because both were eminent ministers, they were natural philosophers, prolific writers, and some of the most well-known demonologists of the time. I saw their writings as a sort of a microcosm of the whole demonological witchcraft experience in England and New England. So I believe that the writings of these men would give me a context from which to construct a more accurate view of witchcraft beliefs at the time. However, that was quite naive, as I discovered, since divergent ideas between the intellectual and the popular belief in witches, and by popular I mean the belief held by the common peasant, these disrupt any coherent model for witchcraft at the time. So before we get into why that's so difficult to do, we should talk a bit about magic and witchcraft in early modern England. So the early modern period in the Atlantic world can be roughly demarcated from about 1500 to 1750. That's the time period we'll be talking about. Early in the 16th century in England, there existed a vibrant and fairly ubiquitous belief in the supernatural, and occult practices were fairly prevalent. Occult simply meaning hidden from humans, not demonic like in the modern connotation. Peasant ideas of magic were commonplace prior to the Protestant Reformation, including both the black magic, the harmful magic associated with witchcraft, and its more beneficial counterpart, which we call today white magic. White magic can cover a variety of occult practices, from astrology, which is basically the reading and manipulation of astronomical phenomena, to something called metaposcopy, which is, you can see on the screen here, a form of divination using the lines on one forehead, right? You can, people believed you can tell certain things about people just by reading those. So indeed, the English religious tradition is full of practitioners who manipulated what they believe were superhuman powers through a variety of astrological techniques, divination, sorcery, and charms that remain really difficult for the historian to kind of decipher today. Recent historiography has actually shown that a belief in such natural magic in England was commonplace even after the Protestant Reformation, which transformed the newly Protestant religious landscape of the British Isles. For example, Richard Saunders, whose work you can see on the screen, was a famous purveyor of prophetic almanacs, and it shows that such things as high magic, or occult practice requiring training and educated speculation, right? That was still very much in fashion in cities like London. In a similar way, low magic, which can be comprised of smaller, local practices requiring little education and mostly oral transmission, attracted many clients in small villages and local rural communities. So as we can see, a belief in the supernatural was commonplace both before and after the Reformation in England. And indeed, it lived on for a while after the early modern period, in some form or another at least. So the notion of a witch, which I focused my study on, is a little bit different because it shows us a much more accurate description of the pervasive changes that were necessitated by a highly volatile and sometimes militant religious culture following the Protestant Reformation. From this, historians have distinguished three separate methods of discourse, or ways of talking about witchcraft, in order to explain these shifting beliefs that they saw over time, right? Three different time periods and explanations. So these were popular definitions of the witch, held by commoners prior to the Reformation. Legalistic definitions of the witch focused on societal reform during and immediately after the Reformation, and harshly punitive diabolical definitions of the witch that came later on. And we'll talk about these in turn. So first, let's talk about the early reformative tradition prior to the Reformation. So the first way of talking about witchcraft, which is attributed to the period prior to the Reformation, shows a belief in witchcraft similar to the understanding of vibrant peasant beliefs concerning other types of magic that we talked about. That is, most people accepted the existence of witches, that witches actually existed, and their harmful preternatural abilities as a part of everyday life. Witches were simply normal. In essence, witches were natural beings with hidden magical powers, manipulating others through curses and charms. Thus, to resist these powers, one wouldn't really resort to execution or trials, but essentially you would fight fire with fire. Traditional forms of counter magic involved the wearing of protective charms or amulets, seeking the assistance of a local wise man or woman, or even such things as scratching the face of the alleged witch to break their hold over you. So in extraordinary circumstances, when witchcraft was tried outside the village community, when it was tried in the churches, it involved appealing to ecclesiastical courts, where witches were basically reformed. As you can see on the screen here, is a 15th century depiction of a bishop exorcising possessed men. And unlike later, after they were exorcised, they were simply cured, and there would be no more really interruption from the church in their lives. So now we can talk about a sort of another definition that historians use to distinguish it, which is post-Reformation legality. So the strongly enforced political and religious orthodoxy of the English Reformation somewhat challenged popular belief by offering a second discourse based on the harmful and socially unacceptable actions of the witch. This view attributed witchcraft and misfortune to criminal acts that are punishable by law. A similar system existed in the Protestant areas, especially in modern-day Germany, where it was no longer feasible to ignore accusations of witchcraft, which was explicitly condemned in the Protestant Bible. In the German states, this translated to the mass execution of witches in what historian Trevor Roper calls the witch crazes. However, in England, these simply did not exist during the 16th century in any large form. In fact, it was during this period that lenient legal practices toward witchcraft were first established in England. more than 50% of all witchcraft trials ended in acquittals. And those accused of witchcraft had a better chance of surviving these charges in England than anywhere else in Western Europe. This leniency can be considered a product of highly unstable Tudor regimes, like that of King Henry VIII, who you see up there, where quite simply it was actually easier to try a witch as a criminal than to bring these divisive religious dimensions into very public trials. Now, the last period we'll talk about, which is also post-Reformation, but is also post-Tudor period, is kind of used to describe the period following the English civil wars of the 1640s. And this is where we come to our term demonology. So this third explanation is much more continental than the last two, much more like to Western Europe. This explanation treats witches not as a part of everyday life, not as simple criminals either, but as heretics, blasphemers, and apostates who were all in league with the devil. This definition was propagated by demonologists, or those who studied witches, demons, and malevolent spirits, who were mostly Protestant intellectuals who spread radical ideas from mainland Europe to places like London and Essex. As I stated before, Joseph Glanville was one such demonologist who I studied, and he wrote scientific treatises to prove the existence of witches in leagues with the powers of hell. Now, witches, in this definition, actually flew through the air to Sabbaths, or meeting with these devils. At these meetings, the witches would join in covenant with the devil through profane activities like the anal kiss, which, as you can see on the screen, is exactly what it sounds like. According to the demonology of this time, witches actually gained their malevolent powers through this type of union with the devil, through these kind of gross covenants, right? Now, we can ask as modern historians, where the heck did these ideas come from, right? Who thinks of things like this, the anal kiss? Like, we don't assume they actually happened, so it behooves us to actually think about it a little bit, other than just saying, wow, that's weird. So early modern culture was actually highly sensitive to contrary opposition, right? Proving things by virtue of their opposite. So, for example, King James I, who was a demonologist before he was King of England while he was King of Scotland, wrote that the rule of the lawful good king is actually legitimized by the actions of the usurping tyrant, right? So this idea of inversion, this idea that things are always seen in clearer light by their opposition, is displayed in Cotton Mather's treatment of curiosities in his book, Wonders of the Invisible World. We can take a quick quote from there. So Mather, where he wrote on witches perverting and mocking Christian ritual for their own ends, and I quote here, he said, "What is their making of the afflicted rise with the touch of their hand? What is their entering their names in a book, but a blasphemous imitation of certain things recorded about our Savior or his prophets, or the saints in the kingdom of God?" In other words, the witch's covenant with the devil is explained in opposition to the Christian's covenant with God. So we can understand how demonologists explain specific acts like the anal kiss, but what was the purpose of these explanations? Why did they make them in the first place? I think that in the same way, demonologists like Glanville and later Cotton Mather used this idea of inversion to strengthen the orthodoxy of their own institutions following the English Civil War. English Civil War, in very, very broad strokes of the 1640s, can roughly be explained as a movement of concerned Anglicans against an English monarchy that was seen as becoming dangerously Catholic. According to ministers like Glanville, however, this movement went a little far in allowing radical Protestant institutions to thrive during England's years of republic. Radical Protestant and somewhat secular. So after the Restoration, Glanville, who was a chaplain of the restored monarchy, attempted to combat radical notions like those of Balthazar Bekker, the famous skeptic who denied the very existence of a devil at all, that there was no Satan, right? Glanville argued that evil spirits and the witches to whom they gave power, which he wrote about, actually belong in a chain of natural causation leading from the devil to God. Thus, doing so, attempting to prove the reality and the imminent danger of witches and their master, the devil, demonologists actually revealed a vibrant spirit world of angels and demons, right? Which, most importantly, was overseen by a fully sovereign God. So attempting to enforce their own orthodoxy there. So we can see that demonology is clearly fueled by religious motives, right? However, while I was researching the writings of Joseph Glanville and other demonologists, it became clear that demonology was, for the most part, actually an intellectual study. In addition to his duties as a minister, Joseph Glanville was also an ambitious scholar and a member of the English Royal Society. Now, the English Royal Society was self-consciously identified with a popular Baconian ideology. The key to scientific discovery in this new philosophy lay in new experimentation and observation, championed by the scientific method. Proponents of Bacon's scientific method, including Glanville, belonged to an elite scientific community that used this idea to prove the ideas of witches. And this elite scientific community was in no way representative of most English citizens. Now, as I stated, there are three common periods that historians use to explain shifting definitions of the witch over time. However, observing the overlap between the religious and the intellectual discourses, I started to question how accurate these distinctions really are. For example, the debates between Glanville and his critics, other skeptics, revolved around the validity of his natural Baconian science, so not so much around religion, but about ideas of the new philosophy, where skeptics supplied alternative explanations that they conceived as more rational. Glanville's greatest critic, the Englishman John Webster, wrote that the only way one could actually deal with witches was through legitimate legal means, very much embodying the legalistic definitions that are normally associated with Henry VIII and the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. And this is quite a bit after. So as is evident in the sometimes scurrilous debates that took place between these two, many skeptics still agreed with lesser legal punishments for alleged witches, not so much with demonology. To further complicate matters, labeling John Webster as a skeptic seems to imply that he scoffed at fantastical stories of witches and the like. Like, modern day people who think about witches and say, how could they have thought that, right? However, in some of his other writings, Webster actually espoused a belief in astral spirits, pygmies, mermaids, sea monsters, and other common peasant traditions. In brief, while Glanville labeled his enemies irreligious atheists, men like Webster actually held an idea of witchcraft and other ideas commensurate with the pre-Reformation discourse on traditional folk belief. So therefore, while some historians present these three discourses as a shift in definition of over time, Webster seems to have held all three dominant beliefs at once, or at least to contend with all three at once. Therefore, I hypothesize that while there were indeed three discourses used to talk about witchcraft, these do not, as historians have written, apply only to three distinct time periods, but rather they correspond to three distinct views that were all held concurrently by different groups within the same period. And here you can see the three general definitions that I kind of got from that, the concurrent definitions during the 17th and 18th centuries. So these correspond to the three themes that are commonly used to chart shifts in English witchcraft beliefs, though I've reorganized them, instead corresponding to the different social groups that existed all within the same time. So first we have the common peasant, who defines the witch as a natural phenomena to be countered by traditional remedies. Then we have the intellectual skeptics, those who didn't believe in diabolical witchcraft, who define the witch as just a criminal to be prosecuted in the very lenient court system. Lastly, we have the demonologists, who define the witch as a servant of the devil. So after exploring these themes from an English point of view and forming that hypothesis, I turned to the New World to test whether these themes actually translated to a similar but altogether different context, and that was in New England. So starting this research, I expected demonological discourse to flourish in New England, right? I expected that to be the only explanation really there, while the other two explanations were nowhere to be found. This is what I expected. And for two reasons mainly. First, I expected the radical Protestant origins of the New England colonies, which are very much religious endeavors, would suggest a complete opposition to traditional occult practices that labeled witches as the first method of discourse, as commonplace. As historian John Butler writes, few colonial ventures were led by such self-conscious, narrow Christians as were the English colonies in America. New England was a refuge for Protestants concerned with the coming of God's kingdom in a very literal way. Any occult presence threatened the fulfillment of the apocalyptic warning in Matthew 24, that of false prophets showing great signs and wonders to the magicians, diviners, and sorcerers of his own time. Cotton Mather himself assured New Englanders that the 1,000 years of prosperity for the Church of God wasn't really far off, though he warned that the presence of any occultists or witches endangered this, very Puritan destiny. Secondly, the ecclesiastical natures of the courts in New England suggest there really would be no room for any legal lenient proceedings like those seen in England, or those seen by the intellectual skeptics wary of divisive religious themes. In fact, knowing the fate of those taken to court in Salem in 1692, it was hard to believe that any alleged witch would ever survive an accusation in New England. Because of my hypothesis was really concerning demonology, and I thought that would be the most prominent of the three discourses, I decided to start my study with the writings of Cotton Mather, the eminent Boston minister and demonologist. Like Glanville, Mather was a member of the Royal Society, though his writings were less scientific and actually reflected much more of a deep evangelical zeal. Mather was convinced of God's special providence in the American colonies, and he believed his own publication was a profound part of it. Mather also corresponded with demonologists in England, and though Glanville had died by the time that Mather started writing, Mather wrote in the same style as Glanville, and even appropriated Glanville's text in his own work, Wonders of the Invisible World. And this is the work I mostly looked at. So just looking at Wonders of the Invisible World, on a base level, a lot of historians tend to see Mather's work in Wonders of the Invisible World as little more than a partisan defense of the New England government following the Salem witch trials. And while it's clear that Mather did insert some very quick and somewhat contrived arguments from the Salem witch trials in his work, I think this undermines what I've identified as the main goal of Mather's work, which is more pious than polemical. So when we take into account the whole work, when we take into account most of the texts of Wonders, we can actually recover this book as not a simple partisan defense of his friends, but as a legitimate demonological study argued in the style of Joseph Glanville and dedicated to the religious project of Puritan New England. So reading through Mather's work, it quickly became apparent that my earlier hypothesis concerning New England demonology was actually just totally wrong. So as a demonologist, Mather writes to prove that there are witches, and these witches are in league with the devil. I expected this. However, the majority of Wonders is in fact dedicated to the correction of popular peasant beliefs concerning witches in New England. Contrary to my initial impressions, a traditional belief in magic and occult phenomenon clearly followed English colonists to the New World. This happened despite the best efforts of many colonial ventures to militate against any occult practice. 17th century library lists, which I read, clearly indicate that colonists cared to buy and keep occult books with surprising frequency. The books mentioned in these library lists mostly cover medical practices and astrology, yet there are also many guides for the use of natural magic and the like. It is telling that Cotton Mather, 1 year before the Salem witch trials even started, expressed his concern over the occult proclivities of the lower classes, asserting that those seeking occult remedy were pretty much seeking cures with the devil himself. He was very concerned with this. So in addition to this concern over popular practice that we see in Mather's work, he also reveals that many columnists, like the intellectual skeptics in England, believed that arrest was enough to continue a witch's harmful actions, believed that judicial action was the way to go. Outside of the aberrant events of Salem, the trials afforded to those accused of witchcraft didn't really match the strict religious rhetoric and harsh witchcraft laws of New England. Rather, contrary to their laws, contrary to the actual wording in the laws, lenient legal practices in New England remain surprisingly similar to those lenient verdicts unique to England, or what people thought was unique to England. So as we can see, contrary to my initial impressions, the three concurrent discourses that existed in England at the same time existed in New England as well. So what does all of this tell us, right? Why is it important for the historian to know this? And I'll conclude here. First, it tells us that accepted belief concerning witchcraft cannot be determined on a neat timeline. Varying explanations coexisted, not always peacefully, until around the middle of the 18th century in both New England and England. Like much of history, these themes are complex and rather messy. And as historians, we do our best to provide faithful interpretations to approach a closer understanding. Secondly, these writings show that writers of this time employed a wide use of scientific, legal, and theological apparatuses that deserve attention in the larger study of witchcraft. The study of witchcraft cannot be confined to the witch trials or even the alleged acts of witchcraft themselves. And while I do enjoy the bi-weekly book that comes out on Salem, I think we can look a bit more. Rather, witchcraft and the supernatural permeates early modern correspondence, legal practice, theology, demonology, and much, much more. Finally, as modern texts are an indicator for trends in current historiography, as we said, intellectual demonology actually indicates the accepted lore concerning witchcraft as their time. In their publications, men like Mather and Glanville reveal these accounts that otherwise would be lost to the historian, since a lot of popular tradition wasn't written down. This is evidenced in Mather's quote from Magnalia Christi Americana, where he talks about the neighbors who haven't been careful enough to record and attest the prodigious occurrences of these supernatural events that have occurred among them. So really, without people like Cotton Mather complaining about his fellow New Englanders, the historian would have a much less accurate picture of witchcraft beliefs in 17th and early 18th century New England. And even more of these true and strange occurrences from the invisible world would be faultily buried in oblivion. Thank you. I'll take any questions if you have them.
Questions?
That's cool. All right, thank you very much.